of my favorite sayings, you probably have heard me say this from time to time, especially if food's involved. If it's free, it's me. I'll take freebies all day long. I'm not one to turn down free stuff. But there is an adage in marketing that you don't ever give anything away. One of the elders at St. Paul, I've heard him tell the story more than once. One of the elders at St. Paul had a litter of puppies. And he's not a breeder, but they had a dog, and the dog had a litter, and he didn't want to keep all the puppies. So he took an ad out in the Harlingen newspaper, free puppies. Like four males, 3 females, come and get them, here's the phone number. Nobody responded to the ad. And this went on for like 3 or 4 days. And he's like, okay. So he takes out a second ad. And this time he says, puppies, $25 a piece. 4 males, 3 females, here's the phone number. They were all gone by supper time. All right? Don't ever give anything away. What was he doing? He put value on the puppies. All of a sudden, the puppies didn't change. They were still just as cute. They still were, he wanted to find them a loving home, and they found loving homes. But the only thing that changed was that he let people know that these things are valuable. These puppies are valuable. They're worth something. They'll bring you happiness. They'll bring you joy. The puppies are a treasure. We're talking about treasure this morning here in our passage. And it is a treasure that brings a lot of joy, brings a lot of delight. And sometimes we take it for granted. It comes to us free. But believe me, it is not free. There's a cost. For the last 9 weeks, we've been on a journey talking about delight. And for some of you, when I say this, you're going to go, whew. This is our last week talking about delight. We made it through Justin Rossell's book, Delight. And this is our last week talking about it. Next week, we're going to talk about Thanksgiving, and then we're into the Christmas and Advent season. So we've had this journey. And we've been looking at the word delight, and the Bible has a whole bunch of various terms about how we think about delight. And just about any place that we turn in Scripture, the idea of delight is reciprocal. It's God having delight in us, Jesus having delight in us, and then us having delight in Jesus. And so that's been our journey. We've been learning along the way that God has great delight in us, and that probably is a harder idea to grasp than the idea that we delight in God. God delights in us. Jesus loves me. This I know. The story that we read earlier from the Old Testament, Israel in the Promised Land, the story with Gideon. It was one of Israel's greatest military victories. And we got a little taste of that. Israel's in the Promised Land. God had given them the Promised Land. It's the land flowing with milk and honey. And they still have issues with this people called the Midianites. And so God does. God calls Gideon. He raises up Gideon. Gideon, your job is to go take care of the Midianites. And so that's what happens. Gideon, though, we didn't read this part. It's part of that story, but Gideon has a much smaller army. Midian has in the thousands. Their army's in the thousands. Gideon has 300. He's going up against his army with 300 guys. And he wins the battle. We read it. He wins this battle. Not with might. He wins it with pitchers, torches, and horns. And again, this is the text we read moments ago. They blew their ram's horns and broke the pitchers that were in their hands. The 3 companies, 100 men apiece, They were broken up into 3 companies around the Midianite army. The 3 companies blew their ram's horns and shattered their pitchers. They held their torches in their left hands and their ram's horns in their right hands, and they all shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." So think about this. This is the middle of the night. Midian has this large camp with thousands of soldiers. And Gideon has his 300 men surround that camp. And in a moment, they throw their pitchers down, and the pitchers, loud crash. Think about 300 pitchers all dropping at the same time. You have a big crash. You have 300 clay pitchers being shattered. And then, in that same instant light. Because the torches inside the pitchers now are visible in the middle of the night, lighting up the night. And then, just as there is this bright light coming from these 300 torches, they're blowing their ram's horns. So they've had the big crash, you got the big light, now you got the big horns. Go. And then 300 voices. A lot of light, a lot of noise. 300 voices, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. The visual effect alone would be stunning, but anybody that's been in a movie theater knows that the visual really, it doesn't have that kind of effect unless you got sound to go with it. And if you're in one of those, really cool IMAX theaters, you got a rumble seat that's rumbling underneath you to help you feel the noise, right? That's what's going on here with Gideon. And then the next verse says, the Midianites, they see all this, they hear all this, they're dazed and confused, and God's working in all this, and He scatters them, and they end up turning on each other with their swords. A huge victory. This huge victory is all fueled by sight and sound. Now, fast forward a few hundred years later, quite a few hundred years later, and Paul is writing this church in Corinth, and he's referencing this military victory. He brings this military victory into his letter that he's writing to a church, and this church has all sorts of problems. This church is normal, like us. They got all sorts of issues, and he's been addressing all sorts of issues. One of the issues in this church is they're dealing with pastors that aren't really all that fond of Paul. And the church seemingly, for the most part, starts to follow these guys. And it looks like the biggest issue between Paul and these guys is these guys are like rock stars. They're polished. They're professional. They wear the latest clothes. They're on the cover of GQ magazine. And this church is enamored with these guys. These preachers are more about image than they are about content. And certainly they're more about image than they are about the cross and what Christ has done. These preachers are more eloquent. And if you look at even the first letter that Paul's writing, it even sounds like the way they talk about Paul is that Paul couldn't argue his way out of a paper bag. He just doesn't have those rhetorical skills. Now, I tend to think that is those guys blowing smoke, because if you read Paul's letters, you know that he can write really well. But this church, they're looking for preachers and pastors that want to win friends and influence people. It's all about success. It's all about winning the next conversation. And Paul is saying the Christian life isn't like this. It's not about this. And so he references this military victory. And in doing so, he wants this church to understand that the Christian life, that even their community, is not about trying to be the latest and the greatest and the most successful. In fact, he's going to go the opposite direction. And so as we come to this, as we finish this series on delight, I want us to see that if we're going to be the kind of community that we need to be for Los Fresnos, then we need to listen to Paul. We need to understand what he's saying to this church. Our main message is not, and in fact, you've heard me say this before, if I ever get up here and I start to present the kind of message that what we're about is 101 ways to be successful in your business or to be successful in life, then you need to carry me out and throw me into the middle of the road and go find somebody else. Because that's not what community is about. It's not what we're about here. That's not what Jesus is about. Did you know, you probably heard me say this too, but did you know here in Los Fresnos, more than half of our neighbors here, you can even look at this neighborhood here. I can even see where you're staying. If you look at the neighborhood around us, more than half of the people here in our neighborhood, they're what we call de-churched. They used to go to church. In fact, they were raised in church. They could tell you the Christmas story about Jesus and the little baby in the manger, for the most part. They may even be able to tell you the story of David and Goliath. They used to go to church. They don't go to church anymore. And some of you that are here were like that before the table showed up. A little over 70% here are among the de-churched. They were either figured out that the church was not relevant to their lives, and that became kind of the thing. You know, the messages that I'm hearing aren't really helping me out, so I think I'll stay home. Or they got burned by church, and that tends to be a pretty big category. Something happened. Something happened, and they were on the wrong end of conversation. They were on the wrong end of a relationship, and they got beat up. And so we're done. I'm done with church. More than half of our residents here, it's about 73%. If the table is going to be the kind of community that is going to reach out and remind them that there is a treasure here, then it can't be along the lines of, here's 101 ways to make your life better, because they've already decided that isn't helpful. What is it then? And Paul has the answer for us. What is it then? The de-church don't need somebody even telling them that their lives are messed up. And I've been to church where the message week in and week out is, here's how your life is messed up. I know how my life is messed up. I already know. What they need is something else. What they need is the gospel. And Paul here in 2 Corinthians is saying the gospel is not about success. The gospel is about brokenness. The gospel is about shattered people. And he starts off by saying the gospel is contained. The gospel is contained in clay jars. Here's what he says. We have this treasure in clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. Now, we're not going to unpack everything about this passage this morning. I just want us to focus in on these clay jars. We have this treasure. And what is the treasure? Paul has already spent most of his letter talking about it. The treasure is Jesus. The treasure is the gospel. The treasure is what Jesus has done for us. The treasure is the forgiveness of sins. The treasure is salvation. The treasure is eternal life. The treasure is grace. It's Jesus. It's Jesus and all he's doing for us in our salvation. And as he says, this treasure is in clay jars. Not in fancy packages. Not in a box with pretty bows and cute ribbons. Plain old clay jars. And clay jars, if you have been following along with where Paul is going with this argument, he's talking about people. So the gospel is not packaged in the best PowerPoint presentations that we can create. It's not packaged in the best lives that we can create, the best persona that I can give you. I don't stand up here and try to show you how great Chad Bresson is, because you and I both know that's a failed argument from the get-go. Yeah, Tim knows all too well. That's my cousin, by the way. So yeah, he can tell you that story too. But these jars, these people made up of clay, made up of the earth. That's not an accident that Paul's talking about clay jars. Clay is from the earth. We're from the earth. The whole thing with from dust to dust that we talk about. We're earth people. Clay jars. And the gospel is contained in the common. The gospel is contained in the mundane. The gospel is contained in containers that don't look like much. The cheap stuff. The ones that get overlooked. The ones that are not bulletproof. And that's where he's taken this whole conversation. See, clay jars are prone to shatter in 1,000 pieces. And that's where you find the gospel. And shatter they do. We have this treasure in clay jars that get absolutely shattered and broken. Again, listen to what Paul says. Marco read this earlier. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry the death of Jesus in our bodies. The life of Jesus may be displayed in our body. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that Jesus' life may also be displayed in our mortal flesh. So that death is at work in us, but life in you. Now again, we're not gonna go over all this, but look at these words here that he's talking about. Look at the words: afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, struck down, death, and mortal. And destroyed. This is what the gospel is. These clay jars are afflicted. These clay jars are shattered. They're smashed. They're broken. The gospel is contained in broken people. Our lives that are shattered. So if we're going to be the kind of community that we need to be for Los Fresnos, then it's not about how great our presentation is. It's about being vulnerable. It's about us just embracing the brokenness. Embracing the fact that we are shattered people. And again, what's the point of all this? Well, I talk about clay jars. Remember the story, again, of Gideon? Paul's bringing that whole thing to bear. He's saying that night in the Promised Land, hundreds of years earlier, is a picture of the gospel. It's a picture of what Jesus is doing for us and through us. We want to go to that story, and it really is a miracle. 300 guys beating upwards of, I think it's 10,000 or something like this. It was a miracle. We focus on that. And we focus on the fact that, it was like this whole David and Goliath thing where the impossible happens. But Paul's saying, just like all the other stories in the Old Testament, these are telling us something about Jesus. These are telling us something about the gospel in our lives. And so, when this army of 300 men throw down their pitchers and the pitchers break And immediately there's this grand light that's surrounding the Midian army. That's the gospel. That's what Jesus is doing for us and through us. And that's what Paul is describing in our text. This is what he says. God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. What's contained in these clay jars? Right there. The light of the knowledge of God's glory. The gospel. Christ's death and resurrection for us is the light contained in clay jars. How has God shone in our hearts? Well, He's shown in our hearts by giving us grace and mercy and salvation. He has shown in our hearts by giving us Jesus, the light who's come to dwell among us, as John mentioned. So, the light of the gospel, the light of Jesus, that's what's contained in these clay jars. That's the treasure. That's the treasure. And what Paul is saying is, you know how everybody then sees that treasure? You know how the community around us is made aware of that treasure? When our lives are shattered. When the clay jars are broken. In the midst of brokenness, Jesus shines the gospel. In the midst of a dark mess, all I got to do is, look at my life. It's a mess. In the midst of a mess, Jesus is going to shine the light of the gospel. We are clay jars to be shattered, so that people can see the light of the gospel in us. It's not in lives of success. It's not in lives that always win. It's in the lives of losers like me. It's in the lives of broken. That's what the de-churched in our community need to see from us. Not the best argument, not the best presentation, but shattered lives. Really, who we are. We don't have to put on airs. We're not. We were discussing this morning about clothing. We don't have to have the best clothing. We just be ourselves, and Jesus will use that to shine the light of the gospel for our community. He uses the common, everyday, ordinary, and mundane to do His work of the gospel in our lives and in the lives of the people around us. So, all of this is really counterintuitive, right? We even think about the way he's even talking about we have this treasure in jars of clay, or clay jars. The counterintuitive is you wouldn't put treasure in a clay jar, would you? Where do you put your treasure? Yeah, safe box, right? Yeah. And where is it, by the way? I'm just kidding. It's in the back bedroom in the second closet. Yeah, we keep them in safe boxes, right? And we keep them in nice boxes. When I was growing up, my mother had a special dish set that we only ever used at Thanksgiving. And we may have used them at Christmas sometimes, but mainly Thanksgiving. So once a year, this dish set was brought out. You know why it only was used once a year? It was rare. And I heard stories about how rare that dish set was. But they had this kid named Chad. No, but what they knew about Chad, this is why they kept it under lock and key, and their treasure, is because they had this son named Chad who was notorious for breaking corral. Who breaks corral? Well, I do. I've done it. a couple of times. I'm living proof that the whole marketing campaign behind Corel is absolutely false. You know, the unbreakable. It isn't true that if you hold a Corel dish up and drop it on its edge, that it will not shatter. We keep our treasure locked away because of people who break things. The whole counterintuitive thing about this is that it's in a jar of clay, the gospel. Why? Because eventually the jar is going to get shattered. It's almost expected. Because that's who we are. If we're honest, we're all broken. We all come to the table with something that just is off. And that's exactly what Jesus wants to use and does use. In fact, if we're not broken, we don't really understand the gospel. That's what the gospel's for. That's who Jesus is for. He's for the broken. He gives us peace and grace and hope. He comes to the ordinary. And he makes himself accessible through the mundane. We're going to talk about that in just 2 seconds. Jesus comes to us. Why? Jesus was the original clay jar and is the original clay jar. He came to be broken. He came as the light that shines through the brokenness for broken people. And so when we think about the light, that is God's delight for us. God's delight for us comes as someone who is in our flesh and with our blood and is broken for us. That's his delight in us. That original clay jar who had the treasure that we all needed comes as the light to shine into our darkness. And so when Paul's talking about clay jars, we're simply mimicking. We're simply following what has been done for us. We're paying it forward in brokenness. The more jars are breaking in our community to shine our light, the more that people see the gospel, and the more there is delight. Do we want to experience the delight? Then we just live as broken people in the midst of the community with the gospel. Because that delight becomes evident to others and becomes delight for them, and that's God's delight for us. It's all reciprocal. It's all going at the same time. This is what it means to live with delight. Living with delight means living as jars of clay with a treasure that other people need to see, and they see it in the midst of our brokenness, in the midst of our shatteredness. That's delight. We have this treasure, the treasure of the gospel, in broken jars of clay. Let's pray.